Warning, I say a lot of bad words. If you're under 13, you probably shouldn't be watching this. One of the harsh, crushing realities of the video game industry, and really just about anything in life, is that hard work doesn't always pay off. This is an industry where dozens of people can invest an unfathomable amount of man-hours and budget into a game over the course of years, and there's always a chance it could still be a failure, at least on the business side of things. Of course, plenty of widely accepted bad games sell poorly for being bad games, but then there's the good ones that don't end up nearly as successful as they deserve to be. Even from just a consumer standpoint, it really blows knowing that AAA giants can pump out a broken mess while simultaneously exploiting their player base and horrifically mistreating the staff who were forced to work on it, possibly giving them the boot right after the fact, and still rake in records-breaking amount of cash. Whereas a passionate group of developers can create a game such as Okami that gets critical acclaim and regarded as one of the best games ever made, but also goes down as one of the biggest commercial failures ever made, to the point where its poor sales, along with the poor sales of God Hand, played a big part in shutting down Clover Studio, the Capcom team that created it. Okami came from the creative mind of Hideki Kamiya, best known for his involvement in the older Resident Evil games, bringing Devil May Cry into the world, directing and supervising several Platinum Games titles, and publicly making liberal use of Twitter's block button. This is who I aspire to be like. Okami was essentially Kamiya's take on a Legend of Zelda-inspired action-adventure game, with Zelda being his favorite game series. In spite of Okami's low sales at the time, Capcom's surprisingly given it a pretty significant push over the years. With the main protagonist Amaterasu making cameos in MVC3 and Monster Hunter Rise, the game getting multiple ports and re-releases which helped it reach a much bigger audience than ever, even giving it a sequel on the DS. It's clear that at least somebody at Capcom has a lot of faith in this title, which I find rather fitting given what transpires in said game. I own this game on 4 different platforms. That should probably tell you my thoughts on it right away, but I'm gonna talk about it anyways, and you're all gonna watch it. Unless you leave early. Please stay, I'm very lonely. Okami begins by telling the ancient legend surrounding the small and quaint hamlet, Kamiki Village. A large 8-headed dragon known as Orochi terrorized and loomed over the village, only being appeased after being offered a maiden for sacrifice. Guys, I swear I wrote this entire video before Elden Ring came out, okay? Legend tells on the night of the sacrifice, a white wolf called Shiranui, please excuse any mispronunciations here, and a brave warrior known as Nagi went into Orochi's lair, slayed the beast, and lifted his curse over the village, though at the cost of Shiranui dying in the aftermath, with a statue in her honor and memory being built. Nagi's sword remained in Orochi's lair known as the Moon Cave, sealing away both him and his curse. Of course, we need a conflict in this story, so some mysterious figure travels to the Moon Cave and removes the sword from where it was placed, believing the legend of Orochi to be just a legend. It was not. Thus, Orochi once again begins terrorizing the land, and Amaterasu, a reincarnation of Shiranui, is called upon to once again save the people. I'm gonna call her Ami for short, because that's what the game does. Ami starts off pretty weak and underpowered, due to losing the power of 13 other celestial gods, and everyone having lost their faith. You also meet this little shit. His name is Isun, and his entire character is basically artist and extremely horny. He's probably the very first Twitter artist in the history of existence. Ami and Isun set out for a journey across the fictional Japan-inspired land of Nippon, freeing the people from the effects of the bad guy's curse, bringing life back to the dying flora, and maybe stopping to feed a few of the animals along the way. Or a lot of the animals. Definitely a lot of the animals. Along the way, gaining the various powers of the other celestial gods, and restoring faith in the land of Nippon to help Ami once again defeat Orochi. Here's the thing though, that's only the first act of the game. Okami has a very unconventional way of telling its story. It's structured in what I can best describe as an anthological, nearly episodic series of short stories that ultimately culminate together at the last dungeon and final boss. They all focus on different conflicts and antagonists, developing new characters, and taking you to various places all over the land of Nippon. The first story, like I mentioned, is about putting a stop to Orochi's reign of terror. The other major character of this story is Nagi's descendant, Susanoo. Though he would much prefer to get himself shit-faced with gallons upon gallons of sake and take a nap, than actually take up the mantle of powerful, fearless warrior. That guy at the beginning who removed the sword, that was Susanoo. He spends the beginning of his arc cowering away from his grave mistake, as well as his heritage and the admittedly unrealistic expectations that come from it. Though with a bit of encouragement from Ami, or maybe a bit of torment depending on how you view it, he does become more willing to accept his responsibility, and he ultimately redeems himself, going to face Orochi alongside Ami, and even delivering the big final blow against Orochi's last head. Storyline number 2 involves Scion City, the capital of Nippon, being plagued by a number of things, one of which being a literal plague where Ami and Isun go inside of the Emperor to dispel the origin of it. It's exactly as disgusting as it sounds. That and there's a whole coup with the demon Ninetales masquerading as a priestess, who, by the way, is absolutely stacked, and tricking Ami into getting these powerful fox rods, all ultimately culminating into a battle against a large nine-tailed fox because Ninetales. The third and last story before the final boss has Ami and Isun heading up north to a snow-covered land called Kamui. Here they find a tribe of inhabitants who can transform into wolves, one of whom is Oki. His big character flaw is that he's in way over his head, stealing a sword to single-handedly defeat the evil robot owl demons Lechku and Nechku, and brazenly running headfirst into danger. Not only alienating himself from his entire village, but also nearly getting himself killed multiple times before finally learning the error of his ways. Along the way, we get more insight into both Ami and Isun's backstories, and how they ended up where they are. What I'm giving is a pretty basic rundown of the story, but believe me, there's a lot more here than what I'm telling you, both in terms of what all happens and the themes and symbolism behind everything. Okami is very deeply rooted in the mythology of ancient Japanese legends. It's by no means a one-to-one retelling of Japanese mythology, as doing 5 seconds of research on Google will give away to anyone over the age of, sperm. But knowing this puts a lot of the more perplexing moments of the story into greater perspective. That bit with Kaguya hopping onto a bamboo rocket and going to the moon makes a lot more sense when you learn that it's loosely based on a Japanese monogatari known as The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. So many things in this game are derivative of Japanese history and mythology that you could spend hours upon hours going down a rabbit hole learning what myths all the stories and characters are derived from. It is kinda similar to the way God of War adapts Greek and Norse mythology. Though with that in mind, Okami still manages to stand pretty firmly on its own merits without taking the connections to Japanese mythology into account. A lot goes on throughout the game's runtime, a lot of which you could maybe argue is pretty fillerish, particularly during the second story, but it all plays a big role in what's essentially a long epic about Ami reaching her full power, guiding other characters down their path of personal growth, and bringing faith and hope back to a world where both were lost. For what Okami's trying to do narratively and thematically, I think this unconventional story structure works really well. The storylines involving each side character all begin and end during one of the arcs, and I think it really helps the game execute them effectively without bogging the whole thing down with excessive plot minutia or needlessly dragging them out to fit the game's lengthy runtime. The game just tells their story, concludes it, and then moves on to the next one without shoehorning them into whatever else comes up. For the most part, it's really compelling, and in particular, I found myself really engaged with the character development of Susano in Part 1 and Oki in Part 3, they're super well done. And while admittedly he probably could have been built up more, the game's true villain and final boss Yami I found pretty interesting. Not necessarily in terms of characterization or backstory, because he doesn't really have much of either at all, but more so in what he symbolizes. He's evil, like literally evil. His entire existence is a physical representation of evil as a concept, further emphasized by his basic but imposing outward appearance, the various phases of his boss battle, and his true form. I think Yami's basic everything ironically works at making him a pretty complex villain. He doesn't get so much as a single word of dialogue, and he doesn't need to either because he speaks for himself, and in a way he's kind of been the whole thing you've been fighting throughout the game, even if it isn't that apparent at the start. Now, that said, I do think there's some issues here, and they mainly come down to pacing, I feel. This game is pretty, I guess, wordy. What I mean by that is that this game really loves dumping text onto the player. I hope you like reading because it's a very vital and important skill you should have this day and age, unless you want to end up like Cyril over here.
I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't tell anybody, cause I've been trying to keep it a secret, but I don't know how to read, so I wasn't sure what to do with the list.
Get out of here!
Also, Okami will dump a lot of exposition and text onto you all at once. It doesn't impact my view on the overall story necessarily, but having to read so many text boxes full of dialogue in as short a time span as this game likes to do can get really damn exhausting, especially if it halts gameplay progression for a bit. For an example of what I mean, the game's opening cutscene tells you the lore of the world and establishes the main conflict, and it takes almost 20 minutes before it even lets you play the actual game. To put that into perspective, Wind Waker's opening was only about 3 to 5 minutes before it let you play that game. I don't know, I feel like there was probably a way they could have shortened a good bit of the dialogue into something that's at least a little bit less wordy. Isun in particular is a pretty big chatterbox, now let me tell you about this little shit. Okay, so Zelda games often have that one companion character who accompanies you on your journey. King of Red Lions in Wind Waker, Midna in Twilight Princess, Fi in Skyward Sword. Isun is essentially Okami's version of that, and I'm gonna be honest, he got pretty damn grating throughout a lot of the game. So many of his contributions to the story are the following. Number 1. Shit-talking just about anyone and everyone you come across while complaining about the task at hand that Ami agreed to take on. Number 2, being a gross-ass pervert and hitting on every living human who happens to have a giant bust on their chest. Or number 3, pointing out the fucking obvious so much that it makes me further question why everyone acted like Fi was so egregious about that when this little bastard exists. For most of the first couple of acts, I just wanted to flick this little shit and watch him fly 50 miles per hour into a wall. It wouldn't be so bad if someone else knocked him down a peg more often, but no characters really do that aside from Waka, who's basically a rival character to Ami. To be fair, Isun does get quite a bit more development during the third arc when you get to visit his village and learn about his past, as well as right around the time you take on the final dungeon. That's appreciated, but I really think they should have attempted to make us sympathize more with him before this point. Until then, he kinda just comes off like a one-note jerk, and the game's attempts to make him the comic relief got old for me pretty fast. I really enjoy the goofy tone of this game that's typical of Kamiya's other work, and I think it also balances out with the more serious stuff pretty well. But the stuff with Isun right here kinda fell flat for me. In spite of my gripes, I'd still say that the overall story succeeds where it needs to. You go around playing as a doggo who helps the lives of everybody suck slightly less. At that point, any and all criticisms I may have are kinda just moot points. Like I said before, Okami is an action-adventure game that draws the most inspiration from the 3D Legend of Zelda games. And funny enough, the Zelda game that's the easiest to draw parallels to came out after Okami. If I had a nickel for every Japanese action-adventure game where you play as a wolf that came out in 2006, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's still more money than most rich people pay in taxes. And while Okami just about wears its inspiration clearly on its sleeve, at the same time, it does plenty enough to really stand out as its own thing. I mean, this game has a jump button. Zelda wouldn't bother putting one of those in until over a decade later. You spend the whole game exploring the land of Nippon, which, like in Zelda, is broken up into several different regions. One of the things that immediately caught my attention was just how grand the whole thing felt. You're technically just running through small, self-contained areas the whole game, as peeking at the map will give away, but the game does such a great job conveying this illusion of scale that makes the whole land of Nippon feel organic. Running around the large fields as your speed constantly picks up faster and faster really hits home the feeling that you're partaking in this grand epic adventure, and it's awesome. Okami's most unique mechanic is that of the celestial brush techniques. At any point in the game, you're able to stop the flow of time and perform one of 13 different brush techniques with their own divine effects on the world, or enemies, or objects, or really anything that the game lets you use it on. Such effects include making either the sun or the moon rise to change the time of day, reviving dead flora, spawning a lily pad in the water, manipulating various elements such as water, fire, air, and dirt, fucking magnets, how do they work, and just straight up creating explosive firework bombs out of nothing. The way you activate most of them is either draw a circle, straight line, more than one straight line, or curvy line. It's a pretty simple system to get down, and while there are times when I think the game mistakes which technique you were trying to do, a couple times I accidentally made the sun rise or did something else when I was just trying to revive a dead tree. It really adds a lot to the game by making the environment itself feel like something you can naturally influence and be in tune with. They also play a big role in combat. One of the big areas where Okami differs from Zelda is the greater focus on fighting enemies and the wider selection of tools at your disposal for it. Zelda combat typically doesn't really get more complex than just mash the sword button with a few different techniques thrown in depending on the game. And even a game like Skyward Sword with the whole motion control swordplay thing isn't too much different in that regard. Not a criticism towards Zelda, mind you, just something to point out when comparing these two together. You do have a basic attack which is a variation of either this sword, this shield thing, or these elemental beads that can either do multiple hits of damage, or alternatively act as a projectile. Though it's the enemy variety that really shakes things up here. They all have their own attacks that you either need to avoid or exploit with the proper brush technique. Typically, you need to do this to get their guard down so you can use the slash technique and get the really big hits in. Oh, and you also need to manage how much ink you're using so you don't end up sitting around all naked waiting for it to recharge. I wouldn't call Okami that difficult of a game. In fact, I got through the whole thing without dying a single time. Here's my proof. But I still found the combat to be pretty fun and interesting, even if it's ridiculously easy to break it like a twig. I don't know, I just really like it when enemy variety helps to add a bit more spice to otherwise rudimentary combat mechanics. Really, if you feel like it, you could just ignore combat altogether, save for a few scripted encounters. You don't really obtain experience or anything, this isn't a JRPG, but it's a pretty easy way to make some fast money. The main challenge comes from killing all the enemies in a timely enough manner while taking as little damage as possible. The better that you do, the more yen you're rewarded with at the end of each encounter. You can use it to buy a bunch of stuff like health recovery items, Inkfinity Stones that just about negate the whole issue of limited ink, perfectly unbalanced as all things should be, and bags of food to give to the various animals everywhere. Okami lets you feed several different species of wildlife, including doggos and kitties. This is the best game ever made. While, like I said, you don't gain experience, you do obtain praise for a lot of the shit you do. Going through the main story, dispelling curses, feeding animals, reviving dead plants, side quests, etc. All of that will earn you praise, which can be used for increasing your health, ink pots, wallet size, and astral pouch. That last thing, by the way, revives you if your health runs out, and it doesn't count as a death against you. To fill it up, you collect whatever food items are laying around, and any food you pick up after the pouch is capped off is turned into yen. Literally, the only time I went through an astral pouch was at the final boss. Earning praise is a nice system that plays well into the overarching themes of the game, and gives incentives to do basically everything. Like with Zelda, Okami has several dungeons to explore, but honestly, the selection here isn't all that memorable. Like, they're fine and they have their moments. The sunken ship has a creepy atmosphere with the creative use of raising and lowering the water level. Being shrunken down to enter the Emperor's body is kinda cool. Walking around the moon cave disguised as an imp was pretty amusing, especially because you can draw just about anything on your paper disguise. I opted for the Among Us look, which this game made me horribly regret later on, but as a whole, these parts of the game didn't really do much for me. They felt less like dungeons and more like extensions of the rest of the game world, with a few locked doors and basic puzzles, if that makes sense. If I were ranking them alongside actual Zelda dungeons, they'd probably be somewhere above Breath of the Wild's dungeons and below Wind Waker's. I quite enjoyed the bosses though. For the most part, fuck this guy. The game is pretty generous about what's considered a boss, so to be specific, I'm referring to the giant demons. If you're an arachnophobe, you probably shouldn't play this game because the first of these bosses is a giant demonic spider with a flower in her abdomen that's made of a bunch of eyes. Have fun sleeping tonight! Like other combat encounters, they force you to utilize certain brush techniques to weaken and open them to attack, but they feel a lot more personal and on your level than regular enemies do. The ones that most stuck out to me are fittingly the ones against all the major antagonists. Orochi felt like a pretty sweet culmination of all your abilities up to that point, since he utilizes a number of element-based attacks and obstacles as you go through the process of getting all 8 of his head shit-faced drunk off of sake. That last part I just find really amusing. You defeat the boss by getting him wasted. Ninetales is essentially the game's take on a one-on-one battle of equals between this boss and Ami, since all of Ninetales' abilities and techniques are the same as Ami's to the point where Ninetales even has a celestial brush that it can use against your own. Typically, this mechanic stops time for everything and everyone, but Ninetales having equal control over it really helps push the fact that this boss is on your level. The penultimate boss with Lechku and Nechku made for a really interesting dynamic between Ami and Oki. You have to take on both these two at once, with Ami and Oki cooperating as a single unit, using your brush techniques to help Oki claim the upper hand just as often as you use them as a weakness against Lechku and Nechku. And finally, Yami, the final boss of the game. This part is going to be pretty spoiler heavy, so if you're worried about that, you can skip to this part. This fight is comprised of 5 different phases, all of which seem to symbolize war, destruction, greed, corruption of technology, and the desire of power. It's just like NFTs. It's not explicitly confirmed if that is the case, but given that Yami is the physical manifestation of evil, just like NFTs, it would make sense for this thing to represent humanity's vices. Either way, Yami made for a damn good final boss to end the game off with. After having to put up with a baffling amount of filler, I was saving this for last because it's easily the worst thing about Okami. The last third of the game weirdly rehashed a fair bit of content from the game prior. It pretty much has you redo the entire end of the first act, down to saving the maiden who was being sacrificed, and fighting Orochi for a second time. I know this whole part is a time travel thing 100 years in the past when similar events happened, but that doesn't really change the fact that they basically just copy-pasted a whole chapter of this game, save for thankfully not doing the whole Moon Cave dungeon again. Oh, and because I guess this was just mandated for every Capcom game that came out around this time, there's a boss rush. Enter the Arc of Yamato, where you refight every major boss you fought in the game prior, save for Lechku and Nechku, including Orochi for a third time! Which is fucking ridiculous. First time, it was pretty cool. Second time was kind of pushing it a bit, but I guess there's at least a story reason behind it, so fine, I guess. Third time though, this is just useless padding. If I wanted repeat content in a Capcom game where the word Yamato is involved, I just play Devil May Cry game, okay? I got less exhausted by the imprisoned from Skyward Sword, because he at least shook things up a bit in each fight, and he went down pretty quick. Orochi is the exact same shit every time, and he doesn't go down fast. Just because I enjoy a boss, that does not mean I want to fight it multiple times without anything new to offer. That doesn't take long at all to get old. I'm looking at you as well, Dark Souls 2. That's just the issue with Orochi. The final dungeon itself is really weak because the boss rush is all there is. I recall Wind Waker did a similar boss rush in its final dungeon, and that was also one of the weaker parts of the game in my opinion, but at least outside of the boss rush there was an actual dungeon to go along with it, and a damn good one at that. In Okami, they didn't even bother with that. Just boss rush and then you go fight Yami. Kinda underwhelming, but at least the final boss made up for it. Okami definitely stumbles in a few areas when it comes to gameplay, but all in all, it's a damn good time and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. A lot of which comes down to how well this game blows its audio and visuals out of the water. To be honest, if I didn't know any better, you could tell me that Okami came out literally yesterday and I'd believe you. This game has a cel-shaded art style that fittingly makes it look like a Japanese painting. It's pretty jarring going back to watch early promotional material of this game, with how radically different the realistic art style looks from the cel-shaded eyegasm we got in the final game. Like, this looked great at the time, but it definitely shows its age, and Clover Studio really made the right call with the art direction here. It's not only iconic and wholly unique for Okami, but it's timeless, and it more than likely will never look bad. I could just gush about the way this game looks all day, the beautiful use of color throughout the environments, the simplistic but super expressive character designs, the fact that Ami's drop shadow is literally a single brushstroke. Okami goes all in with the cel shading meets Japanese painting aesthetic, and it 100% works in the game's favor. Most of the time, I despise motion blur with every bone in my body, but I think they actually make it work pretty well for Okami. Legit, this is one of my favorite games in terms of art direction, and I feel like the game's art style actually plays an active role in making the game better. The visuals as well as sound make reviving plants and dispelling curses so visually stimulating. It just never gets old seeing a wave of flowers bloom and spread as you revive everything big and small. Those scenes that play after reviving each area's guardian sapling are some of the most beautiful I've seen from a game. Okami's narrative often has a lot of moments that tend to vary in terms of tone, and the art style does a fine job helping emphasize serious and emotional moments, as well as the silly comedic moments without detracting from either. Not to mention, the soundtrack just slaps ultra hard. Inspired by and composed with classic Japanese instruments, the music is able to convey just about every tone or emotion you could possibly think of. Heroism, tragedy, peace, despair, comedy, celebration, tension. It's really impressive, and it honestly blows my mind just how much music is in this game. The quantity alone is hard to believe, let alone how it has plenty of quality to go alongside it. One moment that struck me especially hard was during the final boss. In the final phase against Yami, the moment you finally regain all the power you need to defeat this thing, a beautiful piece of music called Rising Sun begins to play. The thing though is that while it plays during the final boss, it isn't Yami's theme, it's your theme. The ultimate culmination of all of the things you did and all of the people you inspired, that all pays off with this triumphant theme that plays as you finally put an end to everything. The visuals and music, while strong on their own merits, Both do a great job just tying up the whole experience in a way where every sole aspect of Okami works well at enhancing all the other things surrounding it. It is a bit weird that this game is locked at 30 frames per second while the menus aren't. If you want better performance, you'll need to get the PC port and mod it. Okami's pretty rad overall. It's not entirely airtight in a lot of areas, but I feel like this game is a case where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, if that makes any sense. I can see why someone might think Okami's bizarre issues keep it from quite reaching the high bar set by its inspiration, which is a fair outlook to have. That said, I still say it holds up well as a Zelda clone, and has enough of its own unique ideas and vision to really stand out as something more than just a Zelda clone. If you want something that's actually gonna challenge you, yeah, this ain't it, chief. Though, if you're looking for something nice and charming you can unwind and coast your way through, this game will fit that pretty nicely for you. Okami has ports on PC and every modern console, and to my knowledge, they're all pretty damn solid. My footage comes from the Switch version despite the fact that I own several other versions of this game, and it's done wonders for me at least. To my knowledge, all the HD ports are pretty solid overall, so whichever system you play on has a way of playing this game. Definitely pick it up if it piques your interest. It'll forever be a shame this game wasn't initially met with commercial success to go along with the critical acclaim it received. I can't really act like I did anything to help that, because this game came out when I was young and little me was an uncultured amoeba who sure as hell wasn't gonna touch this game, but still unfortunate regardless. Clover really deserved for this game to be a success at the time when it would have actually mattered for them. Ah well, can't change the past, but I can play shitty games that suck ass because the next video is Balan Wonderworld. Until then, I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified about future uploads. Take care and thanks for watching. I'm out.